Hello. In the previous lecture, we talked about Adam Smith and Heilbroner in the material we used. Heilbroner in his book titled "The World of the Philosophers," um, titled the section or the chapter of Adam Smith, called "The Wonderful World of Adam Smith," to note how um, the vision of Adam Smith on the wonders of capitalism was optimistic. It was a wonderful world. But slowly, we eventually came to see how capitalism has a dark side as well. And hence the title of this chapter now, which is The Gloomy Presentiments of Parson Malthus and David Ricardo. And yeah, the discussion of Ricardo, for example, is preceded in the book of Briones, no? In her work on public fiscal management by the work on Smith. So yeah, there's really a natural continuity when we talk about Smith first, and then we proceed with Malthus and then Ricardo afterwards. So how do we attack this chapter? We start by going back to the 18th century, 18th century England, and one question that we might ask is how many people were living in England at the time? In short, what's the population that period? And when we ask the question of the population today, any place, usually we think that's easy to answer, diba? Because today the governments regularly count the populations. There's a regular census. We have um, official statistics today telling us how many people live in the country, where they live, what their ages are, and many other details. But that was not yet the case in the 18th century in England. They did not yet have this kind of information. There was no regular national population count, as we have today. A census, what's a census? A census is an official counting of the population of a country. It tells the government how many people are living in the country, and yeah, we also gather in a census other information about them. Britain did not have its first national census until 1801. Okay, 1801. So if people in the 1700s wanted to know how many people lived in England, they had to make an estimate, an educated estimate, but still an estimate. It was an approximation. They had, for example, to look for other records that could give them clues, no, or proxies. They could, for example, look at records of baptisms, diba? And that gives us the birth or the number of births, right? They could look at records collected with taxes as well. They could examine other local records and then try to use those pieces of information to estimate the population of the country as a whole. Um, One important early investigator and a mature or quasi statistician was Gregory King. King was a 17th century English statistician. That is, when we talk about a statistician, it was somebody who collected and analyzed numerical information, diba, about society. In 1696, Gregory King estimated that England and Wales had about 5.5 million people. Interestingly, that estimate of 5.5 million people is surprisingly close to the actual figures according to Heilbroner. But what is especially interesting is what King expected to happen in the future. Gregory King did not imagine the population suddenly exploding. He thought about how the population would grow very, very slowly. It's not immediate, it's gradual. Um, he estimated that it might take centuries for the population to double. Now, that prediction by Gregory King is informative. Because at this point, we see how population growth did not yet look like a terrifying problem, right? If anything, a growing population could be seen at the time as a good thing, right? Because more people meant more workers. More workers could produce more goods, right? More production could make the country richer and more powerful. So the question that we need to keep in mind is how did population change? How did population change from being something that could strengthen the country, optimistic vision of the population, into something that could threaten human happiness? No? How did our vision of the population change from the wonderful to the gloomy, from the optimistic to the pessimistic? So to understand that change, we first have to understand what people were thinking about population before somebody called Thomas Malthus became famous. Okay, so let's talk about this change. People were certainly worried about population in 18th century England, but at first they were worried about too few people. They were worried about the scarcity of people, not about how overpopulation. It's the exact opposite. One influential writer who made this argument was Dr. Richard Price. Price was a writer and a political thinker who examined population records and tried to determine whether England's population was increasing or decreasing. He compared records from different periods, and Dr. Price argued that the population of England had fallen by more than 30% since the Restoration. What's the Restoration? The Restoration was the return of the English monarchy in 1660 when Charles II became king after a period in which England had been governed without a king. Dr. Price believed that England had experienced a very large population decline. So, yes, they were worried about the population, but it was not overpopulation which was their concern. It was underpopulation. Okay? So, now, however, there was a problem because there were other investigators who questioned his evidence and his calculations. In other words, they were not necessarily convinced that the numbers that were the estimates of Dr. Price were correct. But at least we see how they took the argument. The people there at the time took the argument seriously. And once people became convinced that England might be losing population decline became a political problem. Why? Because because people increasingly connected population with national strength. A country with more people had more workers, and more workers could produce more goods, and more goods could generate more wealth, and the wealthier country could become more powerful. So population was not simply a demographic issue, meaning demographic meaning size, structure, and growth of a population. Population was not just a demographic issue. Population had become an economic and a political issue. And this helps explain something that might seem strange to us today. By then, the government officials actually encourage people to have children. Where, for example, William Pitt, his government introduced a measure involving poor relief that encouraged larger families. Poor relief simply means assistance provided to people who were unable to support themselves adequately. So we might ask today, would having more children make a poor family even more financially difficult to support? Which is a reasonable question, right? But people at the time were thinking about the issue differently. They were not primarily thinking, how much will each additional child cost this family? Instead, they were thinking, how much can an additional person contribute to the nation? It was the different question that they raised. A child would eventually become a worker, right? A worker could produce something. Therefore, at the time, they thought that a larger population could mean a more productive country. So, notice the intellectual climate which existed before Thomas Malthus. By then, um, population growth was not yet frightening, right? The idea that we're frightened about overpopulation is a historical development. It developed later on. An increase in population could actually even be a sign of prosperity, of national prosperity. And this fitted into a much larger belief that was becoming powerful during the 18th century. The belief that human society could improve. If people could understand how society worked, perhaps they could also improve it. This brings us to one of the most optimistic thinkers of the period, which was William Godwin. So let's talk about William Godwin. To understand why Malthus became so controversial, we first need to understand the kind of optimism he was arguing against. And one of the most important figures was the utopian, no? William Godwin. Godwin was an English political philosopher who believed that human beings were capable of creating a much better society than the one that existed around him. When Godwin looked at England in the 18th century, he saw many problems. There was poverty, inequality, there was political corruption, there was war, crime, suffering. But Godwin did not look at these problems and conclude, that's just how things are. That's just how human beings are. Instead, he raised a radical question. What if these problems exist because human beings have organized society badly, right? It's a totally different question altogether, right? If human institutions create suffering, then perhaps human beings can redesign those institutions. An institution is an established social arrangement or organization, such as a government, marriage, the legal system, property ownership. So Godwin became extremely optimistic about the possibility of social improvement. He imagined a future society with much less inequality, much less conflict, and much less suffering. And today we call this vision utopia, right? A utopia is simply an imagined society in which human problems have been greatly reduced or eliminated. But Godwin's vision went even further. He believed that human beings were capable of what was called perfectibility, which is the idea that human beings are capable of continually improving themselves and their society. William Godwin did not think that we were trapped forever by the imperfections of the present. He believed reason could help us overcome them. Okay? So he was optimistic, really. So his argument was if people use reason and if they remove unjust institutions and if they organize society more rationally, then perhaps poverty and suffering can eventually disappear. At the time, this was extremely or extraordinarily optimistic. Right? He was not saying that government should make some reforms. He was imagining something more radical, which is that human society itself could eventually become fundamentally and qualitatively different. It could become better. It could become wonderful, right? And this is exactly where Thomas Malthus enters the story because, okay, first we must clarify that the question of Malthus was not are the reforms of Godwin good or bad? No, that's an oversimplification. Instead, his question is, what if there's a limit to how much human society can improve? Okay, we can only understand Thomas Malthus in the background or in the context of the optimistic vision of William Godwin. So, what if the problem is not simply bad government? What if the problem is not simply inequality, but what if there's a constraint that is imposed by nature itself? That's how Thomas Malthus challenged the vision of William Godwin. So um, there's something interesting about this debate because it was not a debate or an argument between two strangers because it began within a family. Thomas Robert Malthus was the son of Daniel Malthus. Daniel Malthus was an educated and intellectually curious man. And Daniel Malthus was very sympathetic, no, to the utopian or the optimistic ideas um, associated with Godwin. But his son, Thomas Malthus, became increasingly skeptical of that utopian vision. Okay, he was suspicious of this optimistic view. So Malthus began asking a very uncomfortable question. Suppose we actually succeeded in improving society as Godwin wants us to do. Suppose the government becomes more just. Suppose we are able to successfully reduce poverty. Suppose inequality indeed becomes smaller or institutions become more rational. His question was, would poverty necessarily disappear? In short, can we totally eliminate poverty? The response of Thomas Malthus was negative. No, we cannot. So what's his rationale for this pessimistic response? And his response is that it's because human beings need resources in order to survive. They need food, they need land in which to produce food, and they need other necessities of life. And human beings also reproduce. And the question of Malthus was, can the supply of food and other necessities increase as quickly as the number of human beings? In short, can the supply of food and other human needs catch up, no, with the population growth? This brings us to the discussion on subsistence, right? Because subsistence simply refers to the basic resources necessary to keep the people alive, like food and other necessities. Thomas Malthus believed that population had a tendency to grow very, very rapidly. But the means of subsistence could not necessarily grow at the same rate. Okay? And if population grew faster than subsistence, then eventually there would not be enough resources for everyone to live comfortably. That would mean that poverty could persist even if governments became better. This argument became famous in 1798 when Thomas Malthus published his essay on the principle of population. The title itself is revealing, right? Because Malthus was directly addressing the question of whether society could continue to improve. And his answer was essentially, there is a natural limit to human improvement, contrary to Godwin. Human beings, according to Malthus, may be able to improve their institutions, but they cannot simply abolish the biological fact that human beings reproduce and need food. And this is why Malthus was so disturbing to the optimism of his time. He's not saying your political reforms are incomplete. No, it's not just a matter of what's happening at the time. Instead, his argument is, in principle, even a much better society may still face poverty because nature places limits on what society can provide. Right? So, we now need to understand the thought process, no, of Thomas Malthus. So, the argument of Malthus becomes easier to understand if we begin with a simple mathematical idea called doubling. Okay? Doubling. Saya doble. Pagdoble. Suppose you have one person, then the population doubles. So, simply, one person becomes two persons. Then, suppose it doubles again. 2 becomes 4, then 4 becomes 8, then 8 becomes 16, and then 16 becomes 32. The population is not simply adding the same number each time, right? The population is multiplying. We call this exponential growth. Okay. Now, Exponential growth simply means that the quantity increases by repeatedly multiplying by the same proportion, in this case, doubling. And Thomas Malthus believed that human population had the potential to grow in this way. He estimated that population could double roughly every 25 years under favorable conditions. He pointed to the experience of the United States as evidence that very rapid population growth was possible. So put the analysis, no, of doubling in the population on one side. Let's now compare that with food production. Thomas Malthus did not believe that food production could increase at the same rate. Why so? It's because Malthus believes that human beings can reproduce much more rapidly than we can create new land. We can improve farming, yes. We can invent better tools. We can cultivate additional land. But the physical amount of land available for farming is limited. So imagine two sequences. Now, the population grows exponentially, right? 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, then 16 becomes 32. While food production only increases arithmetically. 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, 5, 6. It's very, very slow compared to the population growth. If you keep going, no, eventually the population number becomes much larger than the amount of food that can be reproduced. And that's basically the Malthusian population trap. Okay? Population trap in the thought of Malthus. A population trap is a situation in which population growth continually pushes against the available resources needed to support the population. Take note, Malthus was not saying that food production could never increase. No? That's a misunderstanding. What he was saying instead is that population could increase faster. Okay? I hope that's clear now. So imagine two runners. One runner is running faster than the other. At the beginning, they may only be as a few steps apart, right? But if they keep running at the same rate, the distance between them becomes larger and larger, right? And Malthus thought that population was like the faster runner. Subsistence, or the supply of food and other necessities, was the slow runner. And eventually, something would have to bring the two back into balance, right? Fortunately, the mechanisms that Malthus identified were extremely unpleasant. The return to balance, because one example he thought was population could be reduced by famine, right? Or it could be reduced by disease or by war, no? Or it could be held down by poverty. So now we now see here a change in tone and mood, right? To the optimism of Godwin. We see in Malthus a very dark conclusion, which is that the capacity of human beings to reproduce could itself create the conditions of human misery, right? So this is a very radical change from the optimism about an increase in population before Malthus, right? Now, if Malthus is correct, we now have to ask a quite difficult question, which is that what stops population from growing forever? And the answer of Thomas Malthus was that population would eventually encounter what he called checks. Checks. A check is simply something that prevents something else from continuing to grow. For example, if you put a limit on how much water can enter a container, that limit acts as a check on the amount of water that can accumulate, right? And Thomas Malthus believed that population also faced checks. Some of these were what he called positive checks. But take note that the word positive here does not mean good. It means that these positive checks are checks which operate by increasing death or suffering. So, positive in the sense of um, something is increased. What's increased? Death or suffering. For example, what's an example of a positive check? A war. Right? A positive check on population can be war because war can kill people. Right? Disease is another example of a positive check on population because disease can kill people as well. Famine can also kill people, or severe poverty can also increase death, and it can also reduce the ability of people to raise large families. So these forces therefore reduce population pressure. But Thomas Malthus believed there was also another possibility. What if people voluntarily limited population growth before famine, disease, or war became necessary? He called this moral restraint. So this refers to a deliberate postponing of marriage or a deliberate limiting of family size when or because people recognize that they cannot responsibly support a larger family. Okay? So yeah, he or Malthus talks about two broad possibilities. The first is voluntary restraint, where people recognize the limits of available resources and choose to have fewer children. The second type is involuntary restraint, where people continue reproducing, resources become insufficient, and nature imposes the correction through poverty, disease, famine, or war. So, yeah, take note of that distinction because Malthus was not arguing that every person was doomed to poverty. He was arguing that population as a whole faced a natural tendency toward pressure on resources. Then less people voluntarily restrain population growth, something harsher would eventually restrain it for them. That insight makes his argument disturbing because nature was not necessarily a friendly force, no, helping human beings progress. Instead, nature here could impose very painful limits. It could become an involuntary restraint. It could produce famine, for example, or disease, which would constrain population growth. Wad murag di pa ko katubag ra ng kilayo pa. Pero ako dyan na ko kung catch up lang ko gamay sa klase gyud. Right. So the question now is, was Thomas Malthus actually right? And there are points in history which seem to suggest that he definitely was right because population continued to grow. Um, and by the 20th century, population growth had become enormous. By the early 1970s, some population projections were extremely alarming. Some projections even suggested that if this rapid population growth continued, the world's population could eventually approach 20 billion people. So think about the problem that Malthus identified. More people would mean greater demand for food, right? And greater demand for food means greater pressure on agricultural land. So perhaps Malthus had simply been right all along, right? But then something happened that Thomas Malthus could not have predicted. Okay, that miracle was that human beings became much better at producing food. This brings us to the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution refers to a major increase in agricultural productivity during the 20th century, produced through improved crop varieties, fertilizers, irrigation, and other agricultural technologies. In simple terms, kung bisayon, nakaapas no, ang food production. The same amount of land could produce much more food. No? Food production was able to catch up no, with the increase, no, exponential increase in population. One of the countries often used to illustrate the problem was India. No? India had a rapidly growing population and had experienced some serious no, food shortages. It could therefore appear to be exactly the kind of country that the Malthusian theory predicted would be trapped by population growth. But interestingly, um, agricultural productivity there increased also dramatically. India eventually produced enough food not only to feed its population, but at times even to export food. So, how did that come about? Did the argument of Malthus simply become irrelevant? Still not quite, no? Because, mm, sorry, Thomas Malthus has touched on something real, which is that population growth creates pressure on resources. It was simply that he underestimated um, the capacity of man to respond to that pressure. Technology can change the amount of food that can be produced from a given amount of land. That's the qualification there. His mistake was not necessarily in identifying a pressure. He was correct, no, in identifying that pressure. His mistake was simply assuming that the productive capacity of society would remain too limited to overcome it. Even beings change the conditions of the problem. So now technology was only part of the story, the green revolution. Something else also changed. It was uh, human behavior also changed. People slowly began having fewer children. So not only did food supply or food production increase to be able to catch up with the exponential increase in population, population growth also slowed down. Okay. So one important factor was birth control. Okay, birth control. Birth control, as you know, refers to the deliberate methods of preventing or reducing pregnancy. As these methods became more widely available, couples gained greater ability to decide how many children they wanted to have. But why would people, however, choose to have fewer children? One reason was urbanization, which refers to the movement of people from rural areas like farms and villages into towns and cities. And moving from a rural economy to an urban economy changes the economic meaning of having children. So, take for example, a farming family. A child may eventually help with planting, with harvesting, with caring for animals, or other productive activities. The child can become part of the labor of the family. But um, take, for instance, a family living in a large industrial city. You cannot simply send the child into the family factory, right? Or onto the family farm. Instead, the family has to pay for food, housing, clothing, and eventually education of the child. So, slowly, children increasingly became an economic cost, at least during their childhood. No? Unlike the previous farming family, where the children were an immediate source of household labor, right? At the same time, rising prosperity changed people's expectations. Families increasingly wanted to invest more resources in each child. Instead of having many children and spreading limited resources among them, among these many children, parents could choose to have fewer children and invest more heavily in each one. So this helped produce a demographic transition, a shift, historical shift from high birth rates and high death rates towards lower birth rates and lower death rates. No? As societies became more urbanized, more prosperous, and more developed. And we see how this change was dramatic. No? It was really noticeable. For example, in Britain, around 60% of married couples in 1860 had four or more children. But by 1925, that figure had fallen to roughly one couple in five. Okay. Again, let me reiterate, around 60% of married couples in 1860 had four or more children. 60%, and it decreased to one couple in five. That's 20% by 1925. Meanwhile, families with only one or two children increased from 10% to more than half at the same time, 1925. So population growth did not slow simply because nature imposed some limits. Instead, human beings themselves changed their behavior. And that's something that the original argument by Thomas Malthus was not able to see. Right? The only moving part, the only agent that he was able to conceptualize was nature. Right? And he did not see that human behavior through, for example, birth control would also adapt. He already understood, right, that people could practice restraint, but what he underestimated was how um, dramatically this economic development itself could encourage people to do so. Right. So let us return to the question with which we began, right? How many people were actually living in Britain in the 17th, you know, yeah, in the 18th century? For a long time, nobody knew with much confidence. But then something important happened, di ba? We talked about how in 1801, they had the first national census. And this first census gave people something they had previously lacked, di ba? Much better evidence that the population was indeed growing. And one important figure which was associated with the census was John Rickman. John Rickman estimated that the population of England had increased by approximately 25% over 3 decades. And that was substantial growth, right? But now something else had changed. People could see population growth happening at the same time that they were seeing poverty, overcrowding, disease, and hardship. So this optimism that they once attached to population growth was slowly getting a bad name, right? They were slowly starting to get disillusioned, by the wonders of population growth. This created a troubling possibility, right? Because perhaps, diba? Perhaps, perhaps poverty was not simply the result of bad government as conceptualized by Godwin, right? Perhaps poverty is not just the result of the moral failure of individual persons. Or, yeah, we cannot just blame an individual person for the poverty. Perhaps population growth itself was connected to persistent poverty. This was an enormous change in the way that people interpreted population. Remember where we began, right? Earlier in the 18th century, people could say, we need more people because more people would make the nation stronger. But slowly, we were increasingly asking, um, what are the consequences of population growth? And they were starting to notice that um, one major consequence is poverty, right? It has a huge transformation, right? That we need to notice because population itself had not suddenly become a different thing. Um, it was always there. Population growth was always there. What changed is our interpretation and our understanding of its consequences. Right? On the one hand, population could be seen as a source of national wealth, but uh, we could also interpret population as a source of pressure on food, wages, housing, and resources. Right? Even people who had previously celebrated population growth had begun to reconsider their position. Like, take for example, William Paley, who is prominent in natural theology. On the uh, Paley's Watch, where he talks about how nature is so beautiful and it looks so designed that you cannot deny that there's an artist who made it, meaning God, right? But William Paley had earlier described population decline as an evil, an enormous evil. But the growing influence of Malthusian thinking pushed attitudes of people in a different direction. Or take, for example, William Pitt, who also withdrew his earlier proposal, encouraging larger families through poor relief. So we see that the mood was changing. Population growth was increasingly becoming something to worry about. And after this discussion that we had on Malthus, we have to proceed to another major figure who lived um, at the same time that Thomas Malthus lived, and his name is David Ricardo. Remember how Thomas Malthus asked, what happens if there are already too many people? But Ricardo would ask a different question. Okay? His question was, even if the economy grows, who actually benefits from that growth? So, yeah. So this is a turning point, right? Because if recall how Malthus had raised a frightening possibility. What if there are more people than the available resources can comfortably support, right? But suppose we have solved the problem, and it looks like we have been able to solve the problem with the different reasons that we've talked about. Suppose food production increases, suppose technology improves, suppose the economy continues to grow, um, we might then expect everyone to become better off, right? But David Ricardo asked us to become more careful. His question was, when an economy becomes richer, who actually receives the additional wealth? Kinsay nadato jud. To understand Ricardo, we need one new term. The term is class. Class. A class is a large social group whose members occupy a similar economic position. For example, workers depend primarily on wages for their income. That's one class, right? Or another class is landowners, the landowner class. Landowners receive income from owning land, right? Or another class, business owners. Business owners may receive profits from investing their money in businesses. So David Ricardo became particularly interested in three broad economic classes: the workers, the capitalists, and the landlords. A capitalist in this context is somebody who owns or controls capital and invests it in production. But what's capital? Capital simply refers to resources used to produce other goods and services like factories, machinery, and tools. No? Investments in production. A landlord, the other class in Ricardo's analysis, is instead somebody who owns land and receives income from allowing others to use the land. Now, notice the potential problem. These groups, the capitalist and the landlord, and even the worker, all participate in the same economy, right? But even if they participate in the same economy, that doesn't mean that they have the same interests. So, for example, take for example a factory owner. The factory owner wants to make a profit, right? To produce goods, the owner needs a lot of workers. But workers need wages, right? Salary. And workers also need food. If food becomes more expensive, workers will need higher wages simply to maintain their basic standard of living. But higher wages increase the costs for employers, right? So the factory owner has an interest in keeping the cost of food and therefore the pressure on wages as low as possible. But now consider the landlord. A landlord who owns productive farmland can benefit when agricultural prices rise, right? Higher food prices can mean higher agricultural income and higher land rents, right? So we see here we have two groups, diba? With opposite interests. The industrial capitalist wants cheap food, so he doesn't have to increase the wages of the workers, while the landowner benefits from expensive food because that means higher um, income on the food that he was able to produce on the land that he owns, right? This is what David Ricardo means by class conflict. Class conflict does not necessarily mean that everybody in one class hates everyone in another. It simply means that different economic groups can have structurally different interests because they receive income in different ways. So, remember in the previous chapter how Adam Smith had emphasized how economic activity could coordinate the interests of different people. And Thomas Malthus had shown how population could create pressure on resources. But David Ricardo adds another problem, which is that economic growth itself can create conflicts over who gets the resulting wealth. So we've moved from one gloomy question from Malthus to another. Malthus asked, for example, can society produce enough for everyone? But the other gloomy question that we've moved towards is that of Ricardo, who asks, even if society produces enough, who will how will what is produced be divided among different classes? So suppose we can solve the Malthusian problem. How do we divide the what is produced? How do we divide that among the different classes? And this question will eventually lead us to David Ricardo's analysis of land, rent, wages, profits, and the corn laws, to which we now turn. So remember how Malthus raised the frightening question of what happens if there are too many people for the available food supply, right? David Ricardo was interested in the related problem, but he approached it from a different direction. He wanted to understand who benefited when food became more expensive. We first need to see the importance of grain. Take note how grain simply means the cereal crops such as wheat, diba? Which was used to make bread, for example. Bread was a basic part of the British diet. So when the price of wheat increased, the effect was felt throughout society. Now, imagine that the population of Britain is growing. That means more people, which means more people need to eat, right? And that means that the demand for grain increases, right? And when demand increases while supply is limited, prices tend to rise, right? Because there's a higher demand, right? So people will really purchase the basic need, which is grain, right? Even if The supply is limited. Yeah, will have to compete with that limited supply. So suppliers can just increase the price, diba? As they want. So we see now the first connection. More people results in a greater demand for grain, which results in higher grain prices. But again, Ricardo's question is who benefits when grain prices are high? And the one group that he was able to identify was the landowners. Man. In Britain, wealthy landowners owned large areas of farmland and received income from them. If the agricultural prices increased, owning productive farmland could become more profitable. But there was another group, the industrialists. Diba? An industrialist was a person who owned or controlled industrial businesses, not like factories. Who these industrialists employed the workers, diba? So, yeah, to reiterate, the industrialist will have to increase the wages when food prices increase. So here we see now economics turning into politics. Diba? They say economics and politics are just two sides of the same coin. Right? Britain had laws that protected domestic grain producers from cheap foreign grain. Right? It was a protectionist system. We call this the corn laws. Diba? Again, um, this is pro industrialist. No, this is pro landowners because this laws, the corn laws, were blocking the importation into Britain of cheaper grain from abroad. But take note how there's a little misnomer here because the corn in corn laws does not just mean the corn that we by which we mean the term corn today. At the time, um, the word corn was broadly used in Britain to be a more general term to mean grain in general, especially wheat. The Corn Laws, therefore, restricted the ability of Britain to import cheap foreign grain. Cheap foreign grain. But why would the government do that? Because cheap foreign grain would compete with British grain, right? And that competition would push grain prices downward. And the lower prices would hurt the economic interests of British landowners. So the Corn Laws protected one group, the landowners, but they created problems for another, diba? The industrialists. And this is the larger point that David Ricardo wants us to see. The question that he wants to raise was who benefits from that price and who loses. And an implication of this is that economic policy, therefore, became a struggle among classes, no? Among groups with different economic interests. Now, we have to then proceed to a key moment in European history, the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of wars involving France under Napoleon Bonaparte and several European powers. Britain was, at the time, deeply involved in these wars. At the same time, Britain experienced poor harvests. So, Britain at the time was facing two problems at once, two problems simultaneously. On the one hand, there was disruption caused by the war, by the Napoleonic Wars. And at the same time, there were periods when domestic food production was very poor. So, the consequence of that is a dramatic increase in grain prices. And yeah, for landowners, this means greater income. But for workers, this meant expensive food. And for industrialists, this meant pressure for higher wages. So industrialists increasingly opposed the policies that were protecting expensive domestic grain. However, the parliament did not simply remove the protection. In fact, the parliament considered making the restrictions even stronger. They wanted to even elevate or escalate the corn laws. And this tells us something about political power, which is that the landowners were not merely wealthy, they also had enormous influence within the British political system. So eventually, the industrialists or the industrialist class began to organize. They submitted petitions to the parliament. So businesses were increasingly using political pressure. That's what we mean by they organized to challenge the economic privileges of the landowning class. Okay, so economic policy in the conception of David Ricardo was not simply about making Britain richer in the abstract. It involved a struggle over how the income generated by the economy would be divided among different groups, different classes. And economists now call this distribution, okay, which simply means how the income or wealth produced by an economy is divided among different people or different groups. And David Ricardo was becoming increasingly interested in precisely that question.